In 1954, the landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education, famously put an end to the separate but equal doctrine that had for decades permitted racial segregation in America. But the country wasn't integrated overnight. Many areas of the country remained stubbornly segregated. Arlington Heights was a Chicago suburb that remained predominantly white, even as its population grew in the 1960s. In 1971, a nonprofit organization called the Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation, or MHDC, wanted to build apartments in Arlington Heights for lower-income tenants. The MHDC also intended the development to be racially integrated. The MHDC planned to use land that was zoned for single-family homes, so it had to apply for rezoning before building the apartments. A number of Arlington Heights residents opposed the MHDC's request for rezoning. The residents pointed out that the plan didn't comply with technical zoning requirements. Additionally, homeowners thought the new development would hurt property values. Finally, even though many residents welcomed racial integration and lower-income housing, others in the community were less tolerant. Ultimately, the zoning board denied the MHDC's request for rezoning, which prevented the project from moving forward. The MHDC sued Arlington Heights in federal court, alleging that the zoning decision was discriminatory and violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The district court sided with Arlington Heights, finding that the zoning decision was not motivated by racial discrimination and had no discriminatory effect. The Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit reversed, holding that the zoning board's decision had a discriminatory effect on racial minorities and that Arlington Heights had therefore violated the 14th Amendment. Arlington Heights petitioned the United States Supreme Court for review. The question for the Supreme Court was this: does government action violate the 14th Amendment if it produces discriminatory results, even without a showing of discriminatory intent? The court determined that a government action with discriminatory results doesn't violate the 14th Amendment unless discrimination was a, quote, motivating factor, unquote. Justice Powell wrote for the five-justice majority. Powell wrote that government actions with discriminatory impact are not automatically unconstitutional. Rather, the plaintiff must show that discrimination influenced the state's decision to take the challenged action. To determine whether discrimination was a motivating factor in state action, courts must consider a number of issues. First, the court must look for discriminatory impact, which occurs when the action, quote, bears more heavily on one race than another, unquote. But discriminatory impact is just one factor. The court should also examine the historical context of the action and look for a pattern of discrimination in the area. Third, unusual departures from standard procedure may suggest a discriminatory purpose. Lastly, legislative history can help to explain the thinking behind the official action. If these factors, taken together, show that discrimination was a motivating factor in state action with discriminatory results, then the action violates the 14th Amendment. Powell then applied the motivating factor test to the situation in Arlington Heights. Powell acknowledged that the zoning decision had a disproportionate effect on minorities, many of whom needed affordable housing. But looking at the other factors, Powell determined that the town's reasons were legitimate. The Arlington Heights zoning plan had been established for years, and it had always favored single-family housing. The MHDC's request to rezone the area for apartments was inconsistent with the town's established preference for single-family homes. The zoning board followed standard procedure for considering the MHDC's request, and the board held hearings focusing on established criteria. On balance, the court determined that the MHDC failed to demonstrate that racial discrimination was a motivating factor in the town's zoning decision. The court reversed the Seventh Circuit's decision and remanded the case for further proceedings. Justice Marshall, joined by Justice Brennan, concurred in part and dissented in part. Marshall agreed with the majority's legal reasoning, but he thought the case should have been remanded for a final decision to the Court of Appeals, which was better suited to apply the motivating factor test. Justice White dissented. He pointed out that the Seventh Circuit decided the MHDC's appeal before the Supreme Court had issued its decision in Washington v. Davis, which established many of the majority's key principles. Justice White would have remanded the case to allow the lower court to reach its own decision in accordance with the Davis case. The Arlington Heights case was important for firmly prioritizing discriminatory intent over discriminatory impact in analyzing whether a government's action violates the 14th Amendment.